All right. So we covered the sympathetic nervous system. What is another name for the sympathetic nervous system? What's another name for the sympathetic nervous system? You can write that in chat. Thoracolumbar, good. Yeah. Due to the origin of the fibers. Visceral, yeah, visceral is both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's another name for autonomic nervous system. That's good. What happens to your pupils if your sympathetic system is triggered? Do they dilate or constrict? They dilate. Good. Yeah. Fight or flight, pupil dilation. And what is the name of the sympathetic nerve fiber that comes before the synapse? There's two names, really. Preganglionic or presynaptic? Good. Yeah, how many neurons are there in the pathway of the autonomic nervous system? How many neurons are there? Two. Yeah. You may be thinking of sensory, which is afferent, and that is 3. But in this case, the autonomic nervous system is a motor system, and there are 2 that extend from the spinal cord. Some extend from the brainstem. Those are the cranial nerves. The cranial nerve. So we're going to look now at the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetic. Parasympathetic nervous system. Too far? Yes, it did. The origin of preganglionic fibers are the pons and the medulla oblongata, and the sacrum. S2 to S4. So therefore, it has another name, parasympathetic. It's also known as craniosacral. So that's another name for the parasympathetic system. Yeah. So there are some differences. That is one. Another difference is that the preganglionic fibers are long and the postganglionic fibers short. There are no chain ganglia. There are no chain ganglia for the parasympathetic system. Or rather, they send long preganglionic fibers or neurons, which end in what are known as terminal ganglia. Terminal ganglia. They're either on the target organ or near the target organ. So there's a difference. They leave the head let's not call it head, let's call it the brainstem. They leave the brainstem by way of, in other words, they use these nerves as their path for cranial nerves. The first three go to the head. The first three just innervate the head. And the last one innervates the viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So here they are, going, 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 slowly gone. So craniosacral, from the pons and the sacrum. Craniosacral, the pons and the medulla. So there are 4 nerves involved, cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10. And the various effectors are, for example, the lacrimal gland, so those produce tears, salivary glands, also for the vagus nerve, the heart, lungs, the digestive system, and the reproductive system. So for males, the scrotum, the penis; for females, the ovary, the uterus; and for both, the bladder. So that's what I wanted to point out there. Parasympathetic. So long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. So the preganglionic fibers, again, they end on terminal ganglia on or near the target organs. Let's look at the cranial nerves. One is the ocular motor, so it narrows the pupil and focuses the lens. One is the facial nerve, regulates the secretion of tears through the lacrimal gland and salivary glands as well for saliva. The glossopharyngeal regulates the parotid salivary gland, and the vagus nerve, it's very extensive muscles and glands of the viscera as far inferiorly as the proximal half of the colon. So the vagus nerve carries about, I'd say 90%. The vagus nerve of all the parasympathetic postganglionic fibers. Sorry, not postganglionic, preganglionic. Sorry about that. %90. It forms several plexuses. The cardiac plexus, Plexuses are networks of neurons. Cardiac, that services the heart. The pulmonary, I don't see the pulmonary on here. The pulmonary, that services the lungs. And the esophageal, those regulate swallowing. You know how the esophagus contracts via peristalsis, so that's regulated by the vagus. And the abdominal aortic plexus. Which innervates the viscera of the abdomen. Yeah, so parasympathetic. So yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. Parasympathetic. The enteric nervous system is the nervous system of digestion, which is independent of all other nervous systems that we have. Yeah, it's basically the nervous system of the digestive tract. It's all on its own. There's 100 million or so neurons that are embedded in the wall of the digestive tract. It regulates the motility of the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and the secretion of digestive enzymes and digestive acid. So these activities also require regulation by the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, but it largely can operate all by itself, the enteric system. And it has its own reflex arcs, and that's you'll look at more closely with the digestive system in part 2. So that's all we're going to cover for part 1. So one thing I'd like to emphasize is that whether a synapse results in an excitatory postsynaptic potential or an inhibitory postsynaptic potential relies on both the neurotransmitters released and receptors for those neurotransmitters. And I will look at that a little more closely, but let me just introduce you to the receptors, because we've seen the preganglionic neuron, the postganglionic neuron. This is for the sympathetic system here, which shows short and long. The sympathetic system shows long and short. The receptors have different names. I'm going to go over them shortly in function, but nicotinic receptors, they receive acetylcholine. They're called such, they're named after a plant. That's at the synapse between neurons. At the target cell, usually the receptors are alpha or beta adrenergic receptors for norepinephrine. Sometimes, occasionally, the receptors are muscarinic receptors, and they're named after a mushroom, poison actually. So that's sympathetic. For the parasympathetic system, the receptors at the synapse are nicotinic receptors, And the target cell receptors are muscarinic receptors. So those are generally the receptors for neurotransmitters. So the types of neurotransmitters released and the types of receptors on the target cells determine the effects of the autonomic system. The sympathetic nervous system has longer lasting effects because the neurotransmitters often reach the bloodstream before being broken down. There's other neurotransmitters as well, besides acetylcholine and norepinephrine. There are some other ones, enkephalin, substance P, neuropeptide Y, neurotensin, nitric oxide. So the cholinergic receptors for acetylcholine fall into two classes, nicotinic and muscarinic. The nicotinic receptors occur on all autonomic nervous system postganglionic neurons, also in the adrenal medulla, and at neuromuscular junctions. And they are excitatory when acetylcholine binds to them. Muscarinic receptors occur elsewhere. They occur on all gland, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle cells. So these junctions up there, these are skeletal. So not part of our autonomic nervous system. Okay, the muscarinic receptors. They are either excitatory or inhibitory depending on subclasses of the muscarinic receptors. So they are called alpha, beta, muscarinic receptors. So that was acetylcholine. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine has adrenergic receptors. Two classes, alpha. So when norepinephrine binds, it is excitatory, and beta, which are inhibitory. There are also exceptions. So there are subclasses of each receptor type. There's alpha 1 and 2, there's beta 1 and 2, Just be aware that there are exceptions. You don't have to memorize every single one, but there are subclasses of receptors and exceptions to the response. Will it be excitatory or inhibitory? So it's fairly complex. They function by means of second messengers. So the beta receptors activate CAMP or cyclic AMP. The alpha receptors suppress it. Alpha 1 receptors use calcium. Now it's fairly complex. But just remember that there are exceptions, and especially that the response of being either excitatory or inhibitory depends not only on the neurotransmitters, but also on the receptors. And we know from previous experience that receptors can be upregulated or downregulated. So both these divisions, this is probably the most important part. Both divisions have excitatory effects on some target cells and inhibitory effects on others. I know that's important because sometimes, you think, okay, excitatory, fight or flight, inhibitory rest. That's not the case. That's not the case. Both divisions, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, can have either excitatory or inhibitory effects. So for example, the parasympathetic division contracts the wall of the urinary bladder but relaxes the internal urinary sphincter. And it uses, so hang on, so both are necessary for the expulsion of urine. And interestingly, it uses acetylcholine for both purposes. So it's not due to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Instead, it's due to the receptors. So I just wanted to make that point. And most of the viscera receive fibers from both systems. Both receive fibers from both systems. Sometimes the effects are antagonistic. Sometimes they're antagonistic, which means that they are opposite. Sometimes they will be cooperative. So it's quite interesting. Antagonistic effects oppose each other. They are exerted through what's known as dual innervation. of the same effector cells. So in the case of the heart, for example, the heart is speeded up or slowed down. The same heart cells are innervated by both systems. The sympathetic system will speed it up. The parasympathetic system will slow it down. So that's one case. Let's just write that down as one case. Or in another case, it could occur, this opposition, because each division innervates different cells. So they may innervate the same cells, they may innervate different cells. So the pupil is a good example of that. So I'm going to show that in a second. I'm going to show that to you in the next slide. Cooperative effects may also occur, of course. So what should I write up here? Antagonistic effects. Cooperative effects are seen when the two divisions act on different effectors to produce a unified effect. So saliva, the production of saliva is one of those. So the parasympathetic system, for example, increases salivary serous cell excretion. And the sympathetic system increases salivary mucus cell secretion. So those are both required in salivation. Dual innervation. So antagonistic effects oppose each other. Cooperative effects are seen when they act on different effectors, producing a unified effect. But interestingly, both divisions don't normally innervate an organ equally. So the parasympathetic division does have a greater effect over the digestive system, and the sympathetic system has a greater effect on, say, the cardiovascular system. So let's take a look at dual innervation of the iris. So the iris is the structure that dilates or constricts your pupil. So let's look at parasympathetic. Parasympathetic fibers of the ocular motor nerve synapse here at the ciliary ganglion. Then the postganglionic fiber goes straight here to what is known as the pupillary constrictor muscle. And that constricts the pupil. And that's a cholinergic effect, acetylcholine. The sympathetic, however, comes from the spinal cord through the superior cervical ganglion, so a collateral ganglion. Then the postsynaptic neuron continues on to a different muscle, the pupillary dilator, and that results in the pupil being dilated. So that's an example of dual innervation, but there's lots of control without dual innervation as well. So it's not always necessary. The adrenal medulla, the erector pili muscle, sweat glands, lots of blood vessels, they receive only sympathetic fibers. And sympathetic tone is a baseline firing frequency. So I can show you this in the next slide. Tone is due to the frequency of action potentials. So an increase in firing frequency, results in vasoconstriction. And this is both by the sympathetic system. A decrease in firing of frequency results in vasodilation. So that's controlled with the sympathetic system, and that tone can shift blood flow from one organ to another. So at any given time, only about 10% of your capillaries are in operation when you're resting. Yeah, so you have arteries supplying capillaries all over your body, everywhere. But only 10% of them are being filled with blood to service those areas at any given time. So you don't need blood everywhere all the time. And so the capillaries are cut off by sphincters, but also, if you don't need those capillaries, the vessels supplying them will be constricted. And I have a request. The last sentence. That one? So if you didn't catch that one, sorry. So, sympathetic tone, vasomotor tone. So here is a sympathetic fiber. Innervating an artery. And this shows the frequency of action potentials is quite high. Strong sympathetic tone, vasoconstriction. However, when the action potentials are less frequent, that results in a weaker sympathetic tone, the smooth muscle relaxes, and the blood vessels dilate. So that brings more blood to a specific area where it's required. Central control, so that the autonomic nervous system isn't entirely independent. No, there is some control by the central nervous system. So for example, part of the central nervous system is the limbic system. Sorry, I should put that in black so I don't confuse it. The limbic system. And the limbic system, it causes emotions to affect the autonomic nervous system. And I'm sure you've felt this before. If you're feeling emotional, like very angry or something, your heart rate will increase. I'm just going to write that all out. Otherwise, it won't make sense. The limbic system is the pathway through which emotions influence the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus is a pathway which tends to control your primitive functions. Well, primitive functions for survival, hunger, thirst, sexuality, libido, for example. The reticular formation in the brainstem nuclei, they can respond directly to cardiac, vasomotor, and the GI tract. So there is a direct influence there from the central nervous system. Spinal cord reflexes are such that, for example, defecation, micturition, those are reflexes. That are integrated in the spinal cord and the brain, the other part of the central nervous system, can inhibit. Fortunately, these responses consciously. One more thing. Drugs affecting the nervous system. So one thing I'd like to impress upon you, not to memorize everything here, but to be aware of how drugs work. So they can be blocking, they can block receptors, for example, they can mimic neurotransmitters. So sympathomimetics enhance sympathetic activity. So the drugs stimulate receptors. So they upregulate the receptors and they increase or can increase norepinephrine release. Sympatholytics suppress sympathetic activity by inhibiting a norepinephrine release or by blocking receptors. So some drugs that are for clinical depression, Prozac is one. I'm not sure of the other ones, but they block the reuptake of serotonin. So serotonin has a mood elevating effect. If serotonin remains in the system instead of being taken up by the neurons, then it will continue the mood elevating effect. Serotonin inhibitors. Let's see what else. Caffeine competes with adenosine, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter causing sleepiness, binds to its receptors. The end. So I'll stop there for now, and we'll have a short discussion.